proud High King Borgus sat astride his destrier. He rode to the Heartland to meet with the enlightened ape who presided over all the Empire's religious affairs. Borgus had relished in the tales of the Simian prophet taking Cyrodiil by storm, speaking serrated words that cut away the festering flesh that had clung to the pantheon of the Eight Divines for centuries. Prophet Maruk identified the elven corruption afflicting the Eight, and he swore to expunge it. For Akatosh was two gods, Auriel and Shor, and Maruk despised all things Anuic, all things elven. He wished to see Shor emancipated from his old merry half, for he was the one true god of this world, and the one true god of men, and his legacy was sacrosanct. This pleased Borgus, because the High King of Skyrim loved Shor as all great Nord heroes do. And so, when he learned the Empire of Men, under the one true god, intended to wage war with the Wood Elves, he rode eagerly through the mountains and into the forests of the Heartland, looking to lend the might of Skyrim to the Empire's cause. He had intended to travel alone, for there were no dangers on these roads that the High King in his jagged crown could not crush beneath his warhorse's hoofs. But appearances were everything in the Imperial City, so he brought a handful of his most illustrious companions, a sample of what the Imperials could gain from a conjoined campaign. Soon, the stroke of quill on parchment would doom the Bosmer for daring to resist the inexorable expansion of the Elysian doctrines. Only the Nordic company encountered an obstacle upon the forest track. The Nords drew their weapons as wild things seemed to writhe out of the understory. The afternoon light filtering through the canopy allowed the Northmen to observe the menagerie assembling before them. Borgus saw a stag prance across the path, spilling its innards onto the soil, which drank the gore voraciously. Viscera adorned its antlers, twisting and dripping over its feral face, and this was by far the most recognisable of the creatures that emerged from the brush. Borgus whispered a prayer to Shor for strength, and to Kine for her cleansing rains to wash away the sickly scent of putrescence that filled the forest air. The incorporeal flood of beasts seemed to coagulate and coalesce into one horrific whole. A mass of tentacles, pelts and carapaces, of mammals, amphibians, insects and reptiles. Organisms that had no right converging. Seams spliced their anatomies together with unnaturally interweaving sinews. External organs congealed and pulsed out of sync. Mismatched limbs protruding from every orifice, flexing, grasping. Some of the warriors levelled their weapons, others soiled their breeches or expelled their breakfasts as bilious shouts. Borgus's pride silenced the revulsion simmering within him, and rallied his men with a bellow worthy of dragons. Though pale-faced and retching, the Nords regrouped, and charged valiantly at the motley mass barring their way. Alas, not even an army could quell the wild hunt. It was over in a moment, and the battlefield fell silent. The anatomical amalgam absorbed each and every Nord, incorporating limbs and bones and organs into its newly engorged ensemble. Even the horses were not spared. When the wild hunt dispersed and returned to the boskage, the trail was left empty. Empty but for a lone figure. An emaciated king, stripped of everything but his jagged crown, was left standing, stupefied by what had unfolded. The only sound came from the shrill whistle of wind passing between his hollow bones. The corpse of High King Borgus staggered the way he had come, on a hopeless trajectory towards home. But the path stretched straight on forever, and felt like walking on the rim of a gigantic wheel, one that turned with his lurching pace, giving the illusion of travel. And only when all hope of home and hearth had faded did the High King die, a victim of nature's wrath. Borgus was the first known fatality at the hands of the Wild Hunt, but he would not be the last. Little did he know that this biotic horror was no freak of nature, but the Wood Elves of Valenwood, manifesting the formless primordial ooze of creation. The Bosmer are classified as elves by most scholars, but there is something inexplicably bestial about them, and it seems that scholars are completely wrong. The Wood Elves are not what they seem. According to the Pocket Guide to the Empire 3rd edition, the origins of the Bosmer are analogous to the origins of the various other elven races that left Somerset to inhabit the mainland of Tamriel. The Dureni, Ayleids and Khaima were all offshoots of the Aldmer, and developed unique cultures, and in some cases unique physiologies, based on their newfound surroundings. And if the Pocket Guide is to be taken at face value, the emergence of the Bosmer is just the same. The guide states, before Man or Mer came to Valenwood, the Forestland was a salmagundi of creatures and strange civilizations. Centaurs, hippogriffs, satyrs, minotaurs, giants, basilisks, fairy folk, hydra, and intelligent apes all flourished there before the first Aldmeri stepped onto its shores. Indeed, the first challenge for the early Aldmeri was to rise from prey to predator in the forest's intricate hierarchy of life. As the Aldmer began to change their ways to match their new environment, adapting to the forest in body and mind, they became known as the Bosmer. This simple explanation for the progeny of Wood Elves could be entirely correct, and we could end the video right here. But the Pocket Guide is not always an empirical source, and as with all texts in the Mundus, unreliable narrators are as abundant as cliff racers in a jib-free Morrowind. If we look beyond the Imperial Library into the teachings of independent academics, and even into the oral traditions of less paper-bound cultures, like those of the Khajiit clans, we can discover an entirely new perspective on just what the Bosmer truly are. The creation myths of the Khajiit, especially those spoken by Clan Mother Anisi, call into question the nebulous distinction between what constitutes a beast race and what constitutes an elven race. Upon first glance, one could reasonably assume that the Khajiit are a race of beastfolk. When Topal the pilot charted the sea lanes of Greater Tamriel, he spied catfolk along the river Niben. A fragment of his journal reads, "The cat demons of 4 legs and 2 ran the river's length, always keeping the boat in their green-eyed sight, hissing and spitting and roaring with rage. But the sailors never had to brave the shores, for fruit trees welcomed them, dropping their arms down to the river's edge as if to embrace the Mer, and the men took the fruit quickly before the cats could pounce." Had you told Topal at the time that these felines were in fact a type of elf, he would have laughed at you, or even torn out your insolent tongue. Such a claim is an affront to high elven virtue. But Clan Mother Anisi of the Khajiit tells the mythic tale of how Azura brought the catfolk into being, and how they were cut from the same cosmic cloth as the elves. In the beginning there were 2 littermates, Anur and Fadamai. To paraphrase, these 2 littermates decided to reproduce in order to share their happiness with more cats, and created the various original spirits. After the second litter, Anur decided he had had enough, for too many children would steal their happiness. But Fadamai's maternal instincts were strong, and when one of her daughters, Kanafi, told her she was growing lonely so high above the world, Fadamai tricked Anur to make her pregnant again. This final litter consisted of the moons and their motions, Nirni, who was the majestic sands and lush forests, and Azura, who embodied the dusk and the dawn. But before she was done giving birth, Anur caught her, and his fury was cosmic. Anur struck Fadamai, and she fled to birth the last of her litter far away in the great darkness. Fadamai's children heard what had happened, and they all came to be with her and to protect her from Anur's anger. And Fadamai gave birth to Lorkhaj, the last of her litter, in the great darkness. And the heart of Lorkhaj was filled with the great darkness. And when he was born, the great darkness knew its name, and it was Namira. And Fadamai knew her time was near. Before her death, Fadamai bestowed gifts upon her favourite children. Fadamai said, "Nirni, to you, Fadamai leaves her greatest gift. You will give birth to many people as Fadamai gave birth today." When Nirni saw that Azura had nothing, Nirni left smiling. And all Fadamai's children left except Azura, and Fadamai said, "To you, my favoured daughter, Fadamai leaves her greatest gift. To you, Fadamai leaves her secrets." And Fadamai told her favoured daughter 3 things, and Fadamai said, "When Nirni is filled with her children, take one of them and change them. Make the fastest, cleverest, most beautiful people, and call them Khajiit." And Fadamai said, The Khajiit must be the best climbers, for if Massa and Secunda fail, they must climb Kanafi's breath to set the moons back in their courses. And Fadamai said, the Khajiit must be the best deceivers, for they must always hide their nature from the children of Anur. And Fadamai said, the Khajiit must be the best survivors, for Nirni will be jealous, and she will make the sands harsh and the forests unforgiving. And the Khajiit will always be hungry and at war with Nirni. And with these words, Fadamai died. Nirni filled herself with children, but wept when she saw that her favourite children, the forest people, could not find their true shape. So Azura came to Nirni, and before her eyes she took some of the forest people, and morphed them into the many variations of Khajiit. But the Elden Shaper, named Ifa, had discovered Fadamai's gift to Azura, and he told Nirni, and Nirni displayed fury worthy of her father. So Nirni made the deserts hot and the sands biting, and Nirni made the forests wet and filled with poisons. And Nirni thanked Ifa and let him change the forest people also. And Ifa did not have Azura's subtle wisdom, so Ifa made the forest people elves always, and never beasts. And Ifa named them Bosmer, and from that moment they were no longer in the same litter as the Khajiit. While this creation story focuses on the catfolk, it also offers some insight into the origins of the Wood Elves. If Clan Mother Anisi's tale holds some fundamental truth, then the Bosmer are no more and no less elven than the Khajiit, except in superficial terms. Both races dwell in the hazy territory between Mer and beastfolk. Imperial sources may be at odds with this story, but it seems as though the Wood Elves themselves align more with the belief that Ifri the Green Shaper, also known as Jeffer, sang them into existence, giving them form from formlessness. An old text titled On Jeffer speaks of the distant past, when the gods walked among mortals, before the god of the forest sacrificed himself to become the first of the Earthbones. An excerpt reads, "When the elven folk walked the land alone and sang songs of power among the trees and stars, Jeffer the singer walked with them. Jeffer gave heed to the nature of the forests and delighted in the gurgling streams and brooks. It was Jeffer who taught the birds to sing their songs of the seasons, and he that taught the streams the tinkling ethereal tune. The very trees are said to have moved close to hear him sing on the warm summer nights of those elder days. It was in this time that the first great ballads of the elves were made, crafted from the songs that Jeffer taught to the sylvan youth, who frolicked to his lively tunes and ballads of nature and the unspoiled forest. In truth, he is worshipped as god of song and forest. While the Aedra are known to have endured on Tamriel well into the Malefic era, such as in the case of Trinomac, it's unlikely that Ifri would have walked the forests in these days. Ifri became the first of the Earthbones. According to varieties of faith in the Empire, after the creation of the mortal plane, everything was in chaos. The first mortals were turning into plants and animals and back again. Then, Ifri transformed himself into the first of the Elnathay, or Earthbones. After these laws of nature were established, mortals had a semblance of safety in the new world, because they could finally understand it. Therefore, it would be reasonable to assume that the stories of Jeffer walking alongside the Sylvan youth placed elves on Valenwood as far back as the dawn, before the initiation of linear time and the laws of physics. The beginning of the Malefic era is generally considered to be at the point in time where time commences, where the cosmos is stabilised, and where the mundus adheres to the strictures put in place by the gods, who collaborated in its construction. While On Jeffer does not explicitly state that Ifri created the Bosmer, it does run contrary to the idea that they were one of the various elven groups to undergo an exodus from Somerset. Additionally, the various sources that attempt to order the events of the Malefic era always fail to adequately document the Bosmeri migration. Take the text titled Before the Ages of Man, for example. The prolific scholar Icantar of Shimmerine speaks of the Durrani diaspora, the arrival of the Ayleids, and the flourishing of their heartland settlements, and the Kaima clans changing as they followed their prophet Veleth to the treacherous terrain of Resdain. Yet not a word of Icantar's comprehensive chronicle is spared for the arrival of the Bosmer. Everything we can learn from the Bosmer themselves suggests they have little in common with the haughty High Elves, beyond their pointed ears. As children, Wood Elves had told the fable of the Ooze. Once, there was nothing but formlessness. The land held no shape, the trees did not harden into timber and bark, and the elves themselves shifted from form to form. This formlessness was called the Ooze, but Ifri took the Ooze and ordered it. First, she told of the green, the forest and all the plant life in it. She gave the green the power to shape itself as it willed, for it was her first tale. The elves were Ifri's second tale. As Ifri spun the story, the elves took the form they have today. This tale may suggest that Ifri shaped all elves, not just the Bosmer. However, the Bosmer are the only race that Ifri holds accountable when it comes to showing the appropriate reverence for his creations. Ifri gave them the power to tell stories, but warned them against trying to shape themselves or the green. Shifting and the destruction of the forest were forbidden. Instead, Ifri commended the Wood Elves to the Green, so that they might ask the Green to provide them with shelter and a safe passage, and as long as they respected the Green, it would obey. Ifri's gifts came with significant restrictions. They could not harvest the bounties of nature, and this proved limiting in fundamental areas of Bosmeri society. For instance, they could not build houses from wood, or cultivate land for agriculture. However, this accord with Ifri came with some advantages that separate the Wood Elves from the other races of Mer. The Bosmer may not be able to physically manipulate their surroundings, but with a concoction of gratitude, veneration, and magicka, they can urge the forest into motion. The text titled Pact Magic Examined explains examples of Bosmer shaping the wood around them, coaxing it into habitations, temples, and even what I suppose constitutes art. Each instance has been highly ritualized, including days of slow, rhythmic chanting. I have heard it mentioned that fasting may be involved prior to and during such an endeavour. It's as if they're beseeching Ifri to allow them to guide the growth of the green, as opposed to moving it through force. Ifri's opposition to the domineering nature of elves is a recurring trend in this tale. This unspoken agreement between the god of the forest and the people of the forest is better known as the Green Pact. And this is where Ifri's third song comes into play. He had created the flora of Valenwood, he had created the Bosmer, and next, Ifri told of all the beasts that crawl on the land, or swim in the rivers, or fly in the air. These Ifri gave to the Wood Elves as sustenance. They were to eat no plants, but consume only meat. Ifri also told that no Wood Elf who was struck down by another Wood Elf should be allowed to sink into the ground, but should instead be consumed, like the beasts. So, in exchange for Ifri's patronage and protection, the Wood Elves could not harm the forest. Instead, they were to use animals and one another for crafting and consumption. There is one last piece of the Ooze fable we have yet to mention, showing the more sinister side of Bosmeri biology. You see, due to their oneness with the green, that innate wildness that dwells within every Wood Elf, there endures a bit of chaos, a part of that primordial formless ooze that never took form, and can re-emerge if not responsibly managed. Therefore, the Wood Elves must subdue their ability to shift shape. Ifri warned the Bosmer that if they violated the terms of the Green Pact, or profaned the pleasing shape he had given them by transforming, then they would be condemned to return to the formless chaos of the Ooze. They would be redacted from Ifri's symphony and left in silence. For the most part, the Bosmer heeded Ifri's words, but that didn't change the fact that every member of the race could feel some ineffable part of their biology and their consciousness that wasn't entirely defined by the laws of time and physics imposed by the Adric Earthbones. And being fallible, finite mortals, it would inevitably prove impossible for the entire Bosmer race to tame this intrinsic savagery. Surely, even Ifri knew this chaotic nucleus at the heart of his chosen people would manifest at times. He taught them to prevent it, to undo it, but he must have also known that it would be used in times of great need, when the well-being of the Bosmer was in jeopardy. It could be argued that Ifri intentionally left a tiny fragment of this formlessness within his flock, so that they would always have a last resort, a nuclear option you could say, to employ against the threat of oppression or extinction. This unique power is unknown to all other sentient races on Nirn, and it is called the Wild Hunt. In his adventures through Valenwood, the Imperial clerk Decimus Scotti witnessed this phenomenon. It was as if a crack in reality had opened wide, a flood of horrific beasts, tentacled toads, insects of armour and spine, gelatinous serpents, vaporous beings with the faces of gods, all poured forth from the great hollow tree, blind with fury. And after it had finished devouring every organism in sight, it collapsed violently upon itself, like a visceral implosion. The Pocket Guide to the Empire 1st edition asserts that the Wood Elves do not like to talk about the hunt, and you can understand why. The chronicler's Bosmer companion, named Gomenai, claims that the hunt is called upon only in the pursuit of justice, and that every monster in the world that has ever been comes from a previous hunt. Those Bosmer that go wild, they do not return. If the hunt is just the manifestation of that primordial ooze, then it's fair to say that all creatures originated from it. The wild hunt is mindless and consumes all. It is not a tool that can be used for individual preservation, but a unified effort, bestial and instinctive, rather than logical and calculating. The wild hunt is a ritual intended to sacrifice a part of the collective, in the interest of preserving the whole. It is a drastic measure, and it has only taken place on 2 documented occasions across Tamrielic history. The first instance was in First Era 369. The Elysian Order was growing ever bolder, and the Elysian doctrines left little room for dissidents. The religious dogma, in all its beatific virtue, created ample justification for imposing its will remorselessly upon all non-believers. Eventually, the rise of the Order proved perilous to Cyrodiil's southern neighbour, Valenwood. And with the support of High King Borgus, the Empire intended to bring the overwhelming weight of colonial dominance upon the forest folk. So, in the name of self-preservation, the Bosmer invoked the Wild Hunt, and engulfed High King Borgus and his retinue before the threat could materialise. Some would call it murder, others would call it aggressive foreign policy. Nevertheless, Skyrim was plunged into 50 years of civil war, and the invasion of Valenwood suddenly became insignificant. The second instance was during the adventures of Decimus Scotti. The hunt was involved during the 5-year war between Valenwood and elsewhere. It appeared as though the Bosmer did not consider this conflict worthy of such drastic action, until the Khajiit broke a truce and sacked a Bosmeri settlement, burning the harbour and slaughtering the inhabitants. The few survivors of this treacherous attack unleashed a hunt which devastated the invading Khajiit. It is possible that other hunts have taken place between these 2 documented examples. The Pocket Guide states that the hunt of 3rd Era 397 was the first in over 500 years, suggesting there might have been at least one in the 2nd Era. Whatever the case, the Bosmer show admirable restraint when it comes to utilising a power with such devastating potential. Ifri's songs, the Green Pact, and the seemingly untamable nature of the Wood Elves all coalesce to create an indomitable corner of Tamriel. Valenwood is notorious for being nigh impossible to navigate if you're not a native. The Pocket Guide details some failed attempts at taming the wilds. It reads, Valenwood was claimed as a wasteland province of the Second Empire, and its geography is partially described in several imperial surveys. Valenwood is noteworthy in that it has no cities or townships built by the Wood Elves themselves. The Wood Elves permitted a few roads to be built by the Second Empire, but neglected their maintenance, as the Bosmer do not need roads to move easily through the thickest forest. Much of the region is impenetrable mangrove and coastal rainforest, with few grasslands or glade areas. Many of the human trading posts established by the Second Empire have been abandoned or claimed by the beastfolk, centaurs, orcs and Imgur, that share the forests with the Bosmer tribes. Humans in general have learned not to intrude in the forests of Valenwood. Many Imperials and High Elves are quick to write the Bosmer off as primitive, uncivilized, or too stubborn to adapt to innovative technology and infrastructure. But there is rhyme and reason to Bosmer customs and to their wildness. Yes, cosmopolitan Wood Elves can be found all over Tamriel, and plenty of them have shaken off their traditions. But within the forests of Valenwood, this culture is alive and well. I can imagine that the deeper you go into the tree line, the more bestial the Wood Elves become, the more attuned to Ifri's green songs of nature they are. This was Ifri's intention when creating his own race from Nirni's formless flock. And these values are what make the Bosmer the absolute antithesis of what it means to be Elven, at least Elven in the Old Merry sense. Races like the Ultima, the Dureni, and the Ayleids endlessly try to impose their will upon the land. Chalk it up to their Adric influence, their reverence for Auriel, and the unyielding will of Anu's blinding brightness. The Mundus is a realm of limitation. The Aedra, in creating the realm, placed rules and strictures upon all things. Time passes steadily, people die, it's all part of the plan. But the Mundus is also flawed. When Magnus and the Magnagi fled their creation, they left rifts in the cosmos. As such, magicka flows freely into the realm, contrary to the meticulous schematics those very gods had codified. Ifri too, despite being Adric, left a small fount of chaos within his chosen people. He sacrificed himself to serve as the scaffolding for the mortal realm, yet he left a fault in the Bosmer that defied everything he had martyred himself for. There is something Padamaic about this otherwise Anuic being. In other words, there is something chaotic about this god who most would assume to be quite orderly. He did take the Ooze and shape it after all, but Ifri is at his heart a storyteller, and no story worth telling is free from conflict. Perfect order is mundane, and despite the name, Ifri does not wish for the mundane world of Mundus to be so mundane. So let's apply this theory to the history of Tamriel. Let's see the difference between the Bosmer and the other races of Mer. When the Elysian uprising overthrew the oppressive Ayleid regime, many Ayleids fled the Heartland, and many sought refuge in the dense forests of Valenwood. It was not too stark of a shift to go from once jungled Cirid to still jungled Valenwood. Back in Cirid, Ayleid hubris had borne bitter fruit. At such profound heights, they failed to see the seething needlings gathering around their feet so far below. But now, these very kings, like King Anumaril of Abigalis, who had worshipped the most egregious of gods, Molag Bal, stood on the shores of an endless green sea, a maze of foliage with half-hidden cities growing like blooms from a flower. Valenwood was Tamriel's garden, and these supplanted tyrants hoped to take root right here, where the soil was rich and fertile. Anumaril is the perfect example of the Ayleid desire to dominate, to conquer, to subjugate. But Anumaril had not considered Ifri's will, a will that ran entirely contrary to his own. The text titled Orbic Enigma 4, The Elden Tree, by Beradalmo the Signifier, tells the story of the Green Sap Tower, and its relationship with the Bosmer and with foreign powers. On the Ayleids, Beradalmo writes, "Of all the prismatic Mer, none were more presumptuous than the Ayleids of the Heartland. They built their tower in open emulation of Adamantia, using as a founding stone the great red diamond they had uncovered, Kim El Adabal, said to be crystallized blood from the heart of Lorkhan itself. Thus did white gold become Tower 1. But of course, the Ayleids were driven out of their domain, and were cut off from their tower. The Bosmer allowed the Ayleids into their land because, for the most part, they agreed not to dissonate the Green Song. But Anumaril had no such respect for Bosmeri customs. The Bosmer supposedly had their own tower, so Anumaril endeavoured to find it. He could not build such an extra-mundane obelisk by himself. It would have taken an army of slaves, and the backing of the gods. Instead, he was going to turn the Bosmer Tower into an imitation of the white gold, made from the limbs of the earth, a defined place from which he could rule his new empire. It is said that he carried a segment of the white gold tower with him, for how but by walking can a spoke advance its hub? This spoke was an artifact of his own creation, called the Staff of Towers. The Greensap Tower was nothing like the white gold tower. They shared as much in common as their respective races of Mer. Unlike the obelisk at the heart of Cirid, the Tower of Valenwood moved of its own volition, and unlike the Kim El Adabal, the founding stone of the Greensap was not distinctive, it was merely an acorn. And to add to the confusion, there was no knowing which tree was the tower, and which acorn was the stone. Such uncertainties were the bane of tyrants. How can an all-powerful emperor protect his royal seat when that seat could just get up and move? Beradalmo writes, "The Bosmer did not build a tower, they grew it, a great grat oak whose roots sprang from a perchance acorn. and this was their stone, and because the acorn might perchance have been elsewhere, thus was green sap manifold and several, and each could walk. Therefore, each green sap was also every green sap. Ignorant Anumaril asked the Cameron King of Valenwood to show him the green sap tower, and because one happened to be standing in the city of Eldenroot at the time, the Cameron King took Anumaril to see it. Once inside, Anumaril sought out the perchance acorn, and presented to it the segment of white gold. In doing so, Anumaril told an ending to this green song. The perchance acorn transformed into a definite acorn. The elden tree sent roots sprawling into Nirn's crust. It would never walk again. The remainder of Beradalmo's story, detailing Anumaril's ambitions, is cryptic, but simply put, if that's even possible when discussing such matters, the once glorious Ayleid king attempted to use the Staff of Towers to turn this Gratoke into an emulation of Tower 1, of white gold, which was in turn an emulation of Tower 0, of Adamantia. He built an orrery there, and waited for green sap to solidify into white gold, but as Beradalmo writes, what he waited for did not eventuate, and perchance he's waiting yet. For Anumaril had hoped to convert green sap into white gold, and thereby make the Heartlander's realm anew. However, Anumaril did not know, and was not able to know, why his plan went awry. You see, Ayleid magic is about will, and shall, and must, but under green sap, all is perchance. And in this tale of arrogance and authority, we can decipher just what makes the Bosmer so unlike their Aldmeri counterparts. You'd have an easier time drawing similarities between the High Elves and their goblin slaves. Goblins do have pointed ears after all. Granted, it will always be up for debate whether the Wood Elves originated in Somerset, but while the Somerset Elves see themselves as descendants of the Aedra, superior to beasts and men, the Bosmer give praise to Ifri for giving them their forms, even if they are mortal. The Ultima resent the realm they're trapped within, considering themselves too exalted for it, and thus believe they are destined to dominate it. The Bosmer, however, embrace uncertainty and find beauty in things that grow beyond their control. Some see beauty in planning and building and carving, in pristine white stone, polished until it shines as bright as Aetherius. Others see beauty in what is left undisturbed, in the will of living things taking the shape nature intended. I believe that these diametrically opposed values, combined with the creation myths of the Khajiit and the Ooze, are sufficient enough to argue that the Bosmer are more akin to beast than to elf. Yet, at the same time, I doubt that Ifri's children care much for such arbitrary distinctions. Attempting to categorise them is just another attempt to order things that don't need to be ordered. And on that anticlimactic note, thank you so much for watching. Links to my social media and Patreon can be found in the description, but please only pledge if you can afford it and really want to support the channel. My name is Drew, you've been watching Drewmora, and I'll see you in the next one.